Picture this. It's the year 793, and you're a monk living peacefully on the island of Lindisfarne off the coast of England. You're going about your daily prayers when suddenly longships appear on the horizon. Within hours, your monastery is ablaze, treasures are being hauled away, and the world as you knew it has changed forever. The Vikings have arrived, and among them are warriors from a land that would one day become Denmark. But here's what most people don't realize. Those fierce raiders were just the beginning of a story that would reshape the entire map of Europe, influence languages across continents, and create a legacy that still resonates in our modern world. Today, we're diving deep into the remarkable journey of Denmark, from its origins in the mists of prehistoric Scandinavia to its position as one of the world's most progressive and influential nations. So buckle up, because this is going to be one incredible ride through time. Before we can talk about Denmark as a kingdom or even as a concept, we need to go back, way back, to a time when the land we now call Denmark was barely recognizable. We're talking about the end of the last ice age, around 1200 years ago. As massive glaciers retreated northward, they left behind a landscape of rolling hills, fertile plains, and countless islands. The first humans to arrive in this newly revealed land were hunter-gatherers, following the herds of reindeer and other game animals. These weren't sophisticated societies by any means, but they were survivors, adapting to the harsh Nordic environment and laying the groundwork for everything that would come after. Fast forward a few thousand years to around 3000 BC, and we start seeing something really interesting happening in this region. The people here began building massive stone monuments called dolmens and passage graves. You can still see these scattered across the Danish landscape today, and they're absolutely mind-blowing when you think about the effort it took to construct them with nothing but Stone Age tools. These weren't just graves, they were statements. They said, "We are here, we are organized, and we're not going anywhere." This was the beginning of a cultural identity that would eventually evolve into something distinctly Danish. But let's jump ahead to the part of the story that really captures everyone's imagination, the Viking Age. Now, when most people hear the word Viking, they think of horned helmets and mindless violence. Let me tell you right now, that's Hollywood fiction. Real Vikings never wore horned helmets into battle. That would be tactically ridiculous, and they were far more than just raiders. They were traders, explorers, craftsmen, poets, and yes, sometimes warriors. The Viking Age, which historians generally date from about 793 to 1066 AD, was a period of explosive expansion and cultural exchange that saw Scandinavians, including the Danes, reaching out across the known world. So what made the Vikings so successful? Well, it starts with their ships. Danish shipbuilders, along with their Norwegian and Swedish counterparts, had mastered the art of creating vessels that were both seaworthy enough to cross the North Atlantic and shallow enough to sail up rivers deep into continental Europe. These weren't just boats, they were engineering marvels, flexible enough to ride out ocean storms, yet sturdy enough to carry dozens of warriors and all their supplies. The famous Gokstad and Oseberg ships that have been excavated in Norway give us incredible insights into this technology, and similar vessels were certainly being built in Denmark. The Danish Vikings had a particular focus on England and Francia, what we now call France. They weren't just showing up randomly to pillage and leave. They were establishing trade networks, setting up permanent settlements, and in many cases, integrating with local populations. In England, Danish Vikings established the Danelaw, a region covering much of northern and eastern England, where Danish law and customs held sway. This wasn't a temporary occupation, this was colonization on a massive scale, and it fundamentally altered the genetic, linguistic, and cultural makeup of England. Hundreds of English place names ending in by, Thorpe, or Toft are direct legacies of Danish settlement. When you visit a town called Derby, Grimsby, or Scunthorpe, you're literally walking through Viking history. Now, during this Viking Age, Denmark wasn't yet the unified kingdom we think of today. It was more of a collection of chieftaindoms, with various petty kings and jarls, that's like earls or nobles, controlling different regions. These leaders competed for power, formed alliances, betrayed each other, and generally kept things interesting. But around the year 800, something began to change. A leader emerged who would lay the foundation for a unified Danish state, and his name was Godfred. King Godfred is a somewhat shadowy figure in history, but we know he was powerful enough to concern Charlemagne, the emperor of the Franks, and one of the most powerful rulers in European history. Godfred constructed the Danevirke, a massive defensive earthwork that ran across the southern border of Jutland, the main peninsula of Denmark. This wasn't just a military structure, it was a statement of sovereignty, a line in the sand that said, "This is Denmark, and you're not coming in without a fight." Godfred's assassination in 810 plunged Denmark into chaos for a while, but the idea of a unified Danish kingdom had taken root. Over the next century and a half, various rulers tried to consolidate power with varying degrees of success. Then came a name that every Danish schoolchild knows, Harald Bluetooth. Yes, that's where your wireless technology gets its name, but we'll get to that in a minute. Harald Bluetooth ruled from around 958 to 987, and he accomplished something remarkable. He not only unified Denmark under a single crown, bringing all those competing chieftains under his authority, but he also brought Christianity to Denmark as the official religion. Now you might wonder why the transition to Christianity was such a big deal. Well, it changed everything. The Old Norse paganism was deeply embedded in Viking culture, with gods like Odin, Thor, and Freya playing central roles in how people understood the world. But Christianity brought Denmark into the European mainstream. It opened up diplomatic and trade relations with Christian kingdoms across Europe. It brought literacy and written records through the church, and it fundamentally transformed Danish society from a collection of warrior cultures to something more closely resembling a medieval European kingdom. Harald commemorated his achievements with the famous Jelling stones, massive runestones that still stand in Jelling, Denmark today. One of them bears an inscription that reads, and I'm paraphrasing the Old Norse here, "Harald ordered these monuments made in memory of Gorm, his father, and in memory of Thyra, his mother, that Harald who won for himself all of Denmark and Norway and made the Danes Christian." Talk about a legacy. After Harald's death, Denmark continued to grow in power and influence. His son, Sweyn Forkbeard, was even more ambitious than his father. Sweyn wasn't content with just controlling Denmark. He wanted England too, and unlike earlier Viking raiders who came and went, Sweyn came to stay. In 1013, after years of military campaigns, Sweyn Forkbeard actually became King of England, forcing the Anglo-Saxon King Ethelred the Unready into exile. Unfortunately for Sweyn, he died just 5 weeks later, but his son Cnut, also known as Cnut the Great, inherited his ambitions and actually made them work. Cnut the Great is one of the most fascinating figures in medieval history, and honestly, he doesn't get nearly enough attention in popular culture. This guy ruled a North Sea empire that included Denmark, England, Norway, and parts of Sweden. He was King of England from 1016 to 1035, and he was actually a pretty good king. He respected English laws and customs, he was generous to the church, and he brought a period of relative peace and prosperity. There's a famous legend about Cnut that you might have heard. According to the story, his courtiers were constantly flattering him, telling him how great and powerful he was, until finally Cnut got fed up with their nonsense. He had his throne carried down to the beach and sat there commanding the waves to stop coming in. Of course, the tide kept rising, soaking his royal feet, and Cnut turned to his courtiers and said essentially, "See, I can't even command the waves. Only God has that kind of power, so stop kissing up to me." Whether this actually happened or not, it's a great story about a medieval king who understood the limits of earthly power. After Cnut's death in 1035, his North Sea Empire fell apart pretty quickly. His sons weren't up to the task of holding his territories together, and by 1042, the Anglo-Saxon line was restored in England. Denmark itself went through a period of internal conflict and external pressure from neighboring kingdoms. But the idea of Denmark as a significant European power had been established, and Danish kings continued to play important roles in the politics of Northern Europe. The medieval period in Denmark was marked by the ongoing tension between royal power and the power of the nobility and the church. Danish kings were constantly trying to consolidate their authority, while nobles wanted to maintain their independence and privileges. The church, meanwhile, was growing increasingly powerful, owning vast tracts of land and wielding enormous influence over people's lives. This three-way struggle for power shaped Danish politics for centuries. One of the most significant periods in medieval Danish history came during the reign of Valdemar I, who ruled from 1157 to 1182, and his son Valdemar I, II, who reigned from 1202 to 1241. These two kings, especially when working with the brilliant Archbishop Absalon, transformed Denmark into the dominant power in the Baltic region. Absalon, who was not just a churchman, but also a skilled military leader, founded the city of Copenhagen in 1167. That's right, Denmark's capital city started as a small fortress built to protect against raiders. The name Copenhagen comes from Kejobmandehaven, which means merchant's harbour, and it quickly grew from a military outpost into a major trading centre. Valdemar I and II, known as Valdemar the Victorious, expanded Danish territory to include Estonia and parts of northern Germany. At its height, the Danish realm under Valdemar I and II was larger than Denmark had ever been before or would ever be again. But then disaster struck. In 1223, while on a hunting trip, Valdemar I and II was kidnapped by one of his own vassals and held for ransom. The price for his release was enormous, both in money and in territory. Denmark had to give up many of its conquests, and although Valdemar continued to rule for another 18 years after his release, Denmark never quite regained that level of dominance. Still, this period established Denmark as a permanent fixture in European politics, and showed that a small Nordic country could punch well above its weight on the international stage. The late Middle Ages were rough for Denmark, as they were for most of Europe. The Black Death arrived in 1349, killing somewhere between a third and half of the population. Imagine that for a moment every second or third person you knew just gone. The social and economic disruption was catastrophic. Labor shortages meant that surviving peasants could demand better conditions, which shifted the balance of power between nobles and commoners. The Church's moral authority was questioned when prayers seemed powerless against the plague. Everything was in flux. In 1397, something remarkable happened that would define Scandinavian politics for over a century. Queen Margaret I of Denmark managed to unite Denmark, Norway, and Sweden under a single monarch in what became known as the Kalmar Union. This is an incredible achievement, especially when you consider that Margaret was a woman wielding supreme political power in the late 14th century, a time when female rulers were extremely rare. She never officially held the title of Queen Regnant, working instead through her young nephew Eric of Pomerania, whom she had crowned, but everyone knew who was really running things. Margaret was the power behind the throne, and then some. The Kalmar Union was supposed to maintain the independence of each kingdom while presenting a united front against German expansion from the south. In theory, it was brilliant. In practice, it was complicated. Sweden, in particular, was never entirely happy with the arrangement, seeing it as Danish domination rather than equal partnership. There were periodic revolts, power struggles, and political intrigues throughout the Union's existence. Despite these tensions, the Kalmar Union lasted until 1523, when Sweden finally broke away for good under Gustav Vasa. Norway remained united with Denmark for much longer, until 1814, making it one of the longest lasting political unions in European history. The 16th century brought massive changes to Denmark, as it did to all of Europe, through the Protestant Reformation. In 1536, King Christian Roman III officially broke with the Catholic Church and established Lutheranism as the state religion of Denmark. This wasn't just a religious change, it was a political and economic revolution. The crown confiscated massive amounts of church property, including monasteries, convents, and lands, which dramatically increased royal power and wealth. The old Catholic bishops lost their political authority, and the new Lutheran Church was firmly under royal control. For ordinary Danes, this meant church services in Danish rather than Latin, a new emphasis on Bible reading and personal faith, and the end of many traditional Catholic practices. The religious upheaval of the Reformation period also played into Denmark's foreign policy. The 16th and 17th centuries saw Denmark involved in numerous wars, particularly against Sweden, which had emerged as a rival power after breaking free from the Kalmar Union. These conflicts, known collectively as the Swedish-Danish Wars, were about territory, trade routes, control of the Baltic Sea, and national pride. Sometimes Denmark won, sometimes Sweden won, but these wars were incredibly costly in both money and lives. One of the most devastating conflicts was the 30 Years' War, which raged across Central Europe from 1618 to 1648. Denmark, under King Christian Roman IV, entered the war in 1625 on the Protestant side, hoping to gain influence in northern Germany. Christian Roman IV was an interesting character, a Renaissance man who loved architecture, music, and warfare, though he was better at the first two than the last. His intervention in the 30 Years' War was a disaster. Danish forces were defeated repeatedly, and Denmark was forced to sign a humiliating peace treaty in 1629. The country was exhausted and nearly bankrupt. Things got even worse in the mid-17th century. In 1657, Sweden invaded Denmark in what became known as the Dano-Swedish War. The Swedish king, Charles X. Gustav, marched his entire army across the frozen sea between the islands of Denmark in an audacious winter campaign that nearly destroyed the Danish kingdom. By the Treaty of Roskilde in 1658, Denmark was forced to give up huge territories, including the southern part of the Scandinavian peninsula, regions that are now part of southern Sweden. This was a low point in Danish history, a moment when it seemed like Denmark might cease to exist as an independent kingdom. But Denmark survived, and in some ways, these disasters led to important reforms. In 1660, following another failed war with Sweden, Denmark underwent a political revolution. The old system, where the nobility had significant power and could even elect the king, was swept away. King Frederik III established absolute monarchy in Denmark, giving the crown complete control over the government. This absolutism would last until 1849, and during this period, Danish monarchs worked to modernize the state, create a more efficient bureaucracy, and reduce the power of the old noble families. The 18th century was a period of relative peace and prosperity for Denmark. The country may have lost its ambitions of being a major military power, but it found a new role as a trading nation. Copenhagen grew into one of Europe's major ports, and Danish ships carried goods all over the world. The Danish merchant fleet became one of the largest in Europe, and Danish traders established colonies and trading posts in the Caribbean, India, and West Africa. This wasn't all positive, of course. Denmark participated in the transatlantic slave trade, owning colonies in the Caribbean like the Danish West Indies, which included the islands now known as the U.S. Virgin Islands. Danish ships transported enslaved Africans across the Atlantic, and Danish plantation owners grew rich on sugar produced by enslaved labor. This is a dark chapter of Danish history that the country has only recently begun to fully acknowledge and examine. Culturally, the 18th century saw the beginning of a Danish Enlightenment. Copenhagen became a center of learning and culture, attracting scholars, artists, and writers. The University of Copenhagen, which had been founded back in 1479, flourished during this period. Danish literature, art, and music began to develop a distinctive character, moving beyond simply imitating German or French models. Then came the Napoleonic Wars, which once again dragged Denmark into conflict. Denmark tried to remain neutral during the wars between France and Britain, but neutrality proved impossible. In 1807, fearing that Denmark's fleet would fall into French hands, Britain attacked Copenhagen without warning, bombarding the city for 3 days and seizing the entire Danish navy. This attack, which killed thousands of civilians, is still remembered in Denmark as one of the darkest moments in the country's history. Left without a navy and under British blockade, Denmark had little choice but to ally with Napoleon. This proved to be a catastrophic decision. When Napoleon was finally defeated in 1814, Denmark found itself on the losing side. The Treaty of Kiel in 1814 forced Denmark to give up Norway, which it had been united with since 1380, to Sweden. This was a devastating blow to Danish prestige and morale. The country had lost its navy, its alliance with Norway, and much of its international standing. Denmark in 1814 was broke, defeated, and facing an uncertain future. But here's where the story gets interesting, because defeat sometimes breeds transformation. The loss of Norway forced Danes to look inward and ask themselves hard questions about their national identity and their future. What emerged from this period of soul-searching was a remarkable cultural and educational movement. Thinkers like N.F.S. Grundtvig promoted the idea of folkelig education, emphasizing Danish language, culture, and history. Grundtvig and others established folk high schools, which were residential adult education institutions that taught practical skills alongside cultural education and democratic values. These schools, which still exist in Denmark today, played a crucial role in creating an educated, engaged citizenry. The 19th century also saw Denmark transform politically. The absolute monarchy that had existed since 1660 came under increasing pressure from liberal and nationalist movements sweeping across Europe. In 1848, revolutions broke out across the European continent, and Denmark was no exception. Facing popular protests and demands for reform, King Frederik VII agreed to sign a new constitution. On June 5, 1849, Denmark adopted its first democratic constitution, establishing a constitutional monarchy with an elected parliament. This date is still celebrated in Denmark as Constitution Day, a national holiday. The new constitution didn't solve all of Denmark's problems, though. The mid-19th century brought another devastating war, this time over the duchies of Schleswig and Holstein, which had complex ties to both Denmark and the German states. In 1864, Denmark fought against Prussia and Austria over these territories. Despite fierce Danish resistance, the war was a military disaster. Denmark was forced to give up both duchies, losing about a third of its territory and 40% of its population in the process. The defeat of 1864 was traumatic for Denmark, a small country that had now suffered 2 major territorial losses in 50 years. but again, defeat led to transformation. After 1864, Danish politicians and thinkers embraced a new philosophy, often summarized in the phrase, "What is lost outwardly must be gained inwardly." Instead of trying to be a military power, Denmark would focus on internal development, education, agriculture, and social progress. This was the beginning of the Denmark we recognize today. The late 19th and early 20th centuries saw Denmark transform into a modern, industrial nation. Agriculture, which had always been important, was revolutionized through the cooperative movement. Danish farmers formed cooperatives to process and market their products, particularly dairy products like butter and bacon. These cooperatives were democratic organizations owned by the farmers themselves, and they made Denmark into one of Europe's leading agricultural exporters. The cooperative model spread beyond agriculture into other areas of the economy, and it became a defining feature of Danish economic life. Politically, Denmark developed a tradition of social democracy. The Social Democratic Party, founded in 1871, gradually grew in strength and influence. By the early 20th century, it was implementing reforms that would form the basis of the modern Danish welfare state. Workers' rights were expanded, social insurance programs were introduced, and education was made more accessible. Denmark was pioneering a middle path between capitalism and socialism, a model that would later be called the Nordic model. Denmark managed to stay neutral during World War I, which allowed it to continue trading and developing economically. The war years actually brought prosperity to Denmark as a neutral country that could trade with both sides. But maintaining neutrality required careful diplomacy and some difficult moral compromises. The period between the wars saw continued social and political development. In 1915, a new constitution expanded voting rights and made the political system more democratic. Women had gained the right to vote in 1915, making Denmark one of the earlier European countries to grant women suffrage. The Social Democrats formed their first government in 1924, beginning a period of social reform that would continue, with some interruptions, for decades. Then came World War II, and neutrality was no longer an option. On April 9, 1940, Nazi Germany invaded Denmark. The Danish government, facing overwhelming military force and hoping to spare the country from destruction, chose to surrender without significant resistance. For the next 5 years, Denmark was occupied by Nazi Germany. This is probably the most controversial period in modern Danish history. The Danish government initially chose a policy of cooperation with the occupiers, hoping to maintain some degree of autonomy and protect the Danish population. For the first few years of the occupation, this policy seemed to work. Denmark was allowed to keep its own government, and life continued relatively normally, but this cooperation had limits. When the Nazis ordered the deportation of Denmark's Jewish population in 1943, Danes from all walks of life participated in one of the most successful rescue operations of the Holocaust. In a coordinated effort involving resistance fighters, fishermen, police officers, and ordinary citizens, approximately 700 Danish Jews were smuggled across the narrow strait to neutral Sweden, where they found safety. Only about 500 Danish Jews were captured and deported to their Cnut at concentration camp, and even then, the Danish government continued to inquire about their welfare and send them aid packages. Most of these deported Jews survived, unlike in almost every other Nazi-occupied country. The Danish resistance movement grew stronger as the war went on, engaging in sabotage, intelligence gathering, and helping Allied operations. When Germany finally surrendered in May 1945, Denmark was liberated, though the island of Bornholm was briefly occupied by Soviet forces before being returned to Danish control. The post-war period saw Denmark emerge as a thoroughly modern, democratic, and prosperous nation. It was a founding member of the United Nations in 1945, and joined NATO in 1949, abandoning its traditional neutrality in favor of Western alignment during the Cold War. In 1973, Denmark joined the European Economic Community, which would later become the European Union, though Danes have always maintained a somewhat skeptical attitude toward European integration, as evidenced by their decision to opt out of the euro currency. The decades after World War II were the golden age of the Danish welfare state. Successive governments expanded social programs, healthcare, education, and workers' rights. Denmark developed one of the world's most comprehensive social safety nets, with universal health care, free education from elementary school through university, generous unemployment benefits, and strong protections for workers. The Danish model balanced this extensive welfare state with a flexible labor market and a business-friendly environment, creating what economists call flexicurity, a combination of flexibility and security. This model hasn't been without controversy or challenges. The welfare state requires high taxes. Denmark has some of the highest tax rates in the world, and there have been ongoing debates about sustainability, immigration, integration, and the proper balance between individual freedom and social solidarity. In recent decades, Denmark has grappled with questions about immigration and integration, particularly as the country has become more diverse. These debates have sometimes been contentious, reflecting tensions between Denmark's traditional values of openness and tolerance and concerns about cultural change and the sustainability of the welfare model. Culturally, Denmark has punched far above its weight on the world stage. Danish design, characterized by clean lines, functionality, and minimalist aesthetics, has influenced architecture, furniture, and product design worldwide. Names like Arne Jacobsen and Werner Panton are icons in the design world. Danish companies like Lego, Maersk, and Novo Nordisk are global leaders in their respective fields. The Lego brick, invented in Denmark in 1958, is one of the most recognizable toys in the world and has become a symbol of Danish creativity and quality. In recent years, Denmark has gained international attention for consistently ranking near the top of global happiness indexes. This has sparked worldwide interest in Danish concepts like hygge, which roughly translates to coziness or contentment, and friluftsliv, an appreciation for outdoor life. While some of this international fascination with Danish lifestyle trends borders on the stereotypical, it reflects real aspects of Danish culture. An emphasis on work-life balance, strong social connections, trust in institutions, and a general sense of security and well-being. Danish contributions to science and culture have also been significant. Hans Christian Andersen's fairy tales are known worldwide. Philosopher Søren Kierkegaard laid important groundwork for existentialism. Physicist Niels Bohr won the Nobel Prize and made fundamental contributions to quantum mechanics. More recently, Danish authors like Peter Hoeg and filmmakers like Lars von Trier have gained international acclaim. Today, Denmark is a constitutional monarchy with a population of about 9 million people. Queen Margaret Roman II, who ascended to the throne in 1972, abdicated in January 2024 in favor of her son, who became King Frederik III. The monarchy is largely ceremonial, with real political power resting in the Folketing, the Danish parliament, and the Prime Minister. Denmark faces many of the same challenges as other developed nations: an aging population, debates over immigration and integration, concerns about climate change, questions about the future of the welfare state, and its role in an increasingly interconnected but also divided world. The country has been a leader in renewable energy, particularly wind power, and has set ambitious goals for reducing carbon emissions. So what can we take away from this incredible journey through Danish history? First, that small nations can have outsized influence. From the Vikings who shaped medieval Europe to the modern Danish welfare state that has inspired social policies worldwide, Denmark has repeatedly shown that population size doesn't determine historical importance. Second, that defeat can be transformed into progress. Denmark's worst military defeats in 1008, 114, and 1864 led to periods of internal reflection and reform that ultimately created a stronger, more cohesive nation. Third, that pragmatism and adaptability are valuable traits. Denmark has repeatedly reinvented itself, from Viking raiders to Christian kingdom to trading nation to modern welfare state, always finding new ways to thrive in changing circumstances. The Danish story is ultimately about resilience, transformation, and the power of shared values and collective action. It's about a people who have weathered invasions, defeats, occupations, and social upheavals, but who have consistently worked together to build a society characterized by relative equality, high trust, and genuine concern for the common good. It's not a perfect story. Denmark has its dark chapters and ongoing challenges, but it's a fascinating one that offers lessons about how societies can evolve and adapt while maintaining core values and identity. From those first Viking longships appearing on the horizon to a modern nation consistently ranked among the happiest and most livable in the world, Denmark's journey through the ages is a testament to the enduring human capacity for change, growth, and progress. It's a legacy that continues to shape not just Denmark, but Europe and the world. And that, my friends, is the remarkable story of Denmark through the ages. Thanks so much for watching. If you enjoyed